In the aftermath of Rome's civil wars, North Africa was rapidly drawn into the Roman Empire's fold. After Augustus's victory over Cleopatra and Mark Antony, Roman authority in Africa stretched from Egypt in the east to Mauritania in the west. Much of the region was still governed indirectly through client kings. Mauritania was ruled by Juba II, a Roman-appointed Berber monarch, and then his son Ptolemy. Juba's rule and marriage to Cleopatra Selene, the daughter of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, was a dynastic bridge linking Hellenistic, Punic and Berber elites. That is, until Emperor Caligula executed Juba's son Ptolemy. Soon after, Emperor Claudius formally annexed Mauritania, dividing it into the new provinces of Mauritania Caesariensis, with a capital at Caesarea, and Mauritania Tingitana, with a capital at Tingis. The Fossa Regia, the old post-Punic boundary, remained a cultural and economic divide. Latin epigraphy and Romanization are densest east of this line. By the mid-1st century, all the Maghreb, from Cyrenaica in Libya to the Atlantic coast, had transitioned from semi-autonomous Berber kingdoms to incorporated Roman provinces. Legio III Augusta was Africa's backbone. Early on, Rome faced resistance from indigenous groups on the margins of its new provinces. A notable uprising was led by Tacfarinas, a Numidian ex-auxiliary who during the early 1st century united Berber tribes in guerrilla warfare against the Romans. But ultimately, Roman forces aided by Mauritanian light cavalry crushed the rebellion. As the revolts were subdued and client rulers gradually phased out, North Africa entered a long era of stability under firm Roman control. The Romans encouraged urbanization and the spread of their institutions. Colonies granted tax exemptions and legal privileges, which helped entice settlers and accelerate Roman civic life. Julius Caesar had already planned the refounding of Carthage as a Roman colony, and under Augustus, it rapidly became the second largest city in the western portion of the empire. Across the region, towns like Cirta and Leptis Magna were endowed with Roman municipal status. Roman settlements, often laid out in a grid plan, took root in fertile inland plains and were key to extending Roman civilization beyond the old Punic coast. Timgad, founded by Trajan, was a textbook orthogonal grid colony with a notable public library. The provinces of Africa were largely at peace, and the groundwork was laid for an age of remarkable prosperity. By the 2nd century, Roman prosperity in North Africa reached an apogee. It was said that African grain fed Rome for 8 months of the year, with Egyptian grain covering the other 4. By the late 2nd century, olive oil rivaled cereals as an export commodity, as groves spread across Tripolitania and Numidia. African red slip was mass-produced, and alongside Tripolitanian olive oil amphorae, became the signature exports visible across the Mediterranean. This agricultural wealth underwrote a flourishing urban culture. Carthage re-emerged as a metropolis, boasting perhaps a few 100,000 residents and a lively port. The city was adorned with grand Roman architecture, a massive amphitheatre, temples, bath complexes, and a Hadrianic-era aqueduct, among the longest in the Roman world, to bring water from the Zaghun springs to the city. Roman civic life took root. Cities were governed by councils of local decurions, and forums buzzed with Roman legal and commercial activity. Roman urbanization reached deep into North Africa, leaving a legacy of magnificent ruins. At Bulla Regia, elite houses adorned with stunning mosaics were also built with subterranean levels to escape the harsh summer heat. These cities featured forums, theatres, arches, and other hallmarks of Roman town planning. The prosperity of the era is reflected in private wealth as well. Wealthy landowners built lavish townhouses decorated with mosaics. At Volubilis, in far-off Mauritania Tingitana, numerous fine mosaic floors have been found. Volubilis grew rapidly under Roman rule, expanding to a walled area of over 40 hectares, and gained monuments like a basilica, capital temple and triumphal arch. Such urban growth across Africa made the region one of the most urbanized parts of the empire outside Italy. Arts and education flourished in African cities, and a notable product of this milieu was Apuleius of Medaros in Numidia, who wrote the Latin novel The Golden Ass. African-born intellectuals and professionals also rose to prominence in Rome. The esteemed orator Fronto of Cirta became tutor to famed Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and the celebrated jurist Salvius Julianus of Hadrumetum helped draft Roman legal edicts. More significantly, North Africa produced Roman emperors. Septimius Severus, born in 145 at Leptis Magna, and Macrinus from Mauritania Caesariensis, the first emperor from the equestrian order, not the Senate. When Septimius Severus became emperor in 193, he brought a newfound imperial focus. Severus cherished his native Leptis Magna, and during his reign, his city was embellished with monumental buildings, a grand Severan Forum and Basilica, and a four-way triumphal arch. These projects, employing high-quality marble and skilled architects, turned Leptis into one of the most splendid cities of Roman Africa, showcasing a fusion of Roman urban design with local patronage. The Severan period also saw administrative reform, as the emperor formally split the large province of Africa Proconsularis. It had been governed by a proconsul, but around 198, the western part was carved out as the separate province of Numidia, including the legionary base, giving him direct military control. Africa Proconsularis still remained a senatorial province, wealthy and urbanized, but demilitarized. Under the Severan generals, there was a push to build forts on the Limes Tripolitanus, a frontier region to the Deep Sahara, often involved in conflict with Berber societies. One of these, the Garamantes, a powerful Saharan people based in the Fezzan, controlled oasis settlements and desert caravan routes. Skilled in irrigation through underground channels called fogaras, they maintained a kingdom that traded salt, slaves and goods across the Sahara. Though never fully subdued, they were a constant pressure on Rome's Tripolitanian frontier. The Severan expansion of forts and farm towers was aimed largely at containing these incursions and securing Rome's southern edge. Severus's son Caracalla later issued the Constitutio Antoniniana in 212, granting Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire. This edict instantly made even provincial Berber peasants Roman citizens, further erasing the distinction between Italy and the African provinces in law and identity. Despite continued prosperity, the 3rd century brought new headwinds. In 238, during a fiscal crisis in Maximinus Thrax's reign, landowners and the provincial governor Gordian rebelled against the emperor's heavy taxes. Though Gordian and his son were proclaimed co-emperors in Africa, the governor remained loyal to Thrax, and their rule didn't even last a month before the revolt was crushed. Legio III Augusta was temporarily disbanded as part of the political fallout. The empire entered a period of soldier emperors and instability during the crisis of the 3rd century. Africa remained relatively stable compared to the war-torn provinces of Europe, but it was not wholly untouched. Tribal incursions and localized uprisings flared on the fringes, and the far west became semi-independent. North Africa also suffered economically, and there was a near halt in public construction. Rome instead prioritized its core provinces, Africa Proconsularis and Numidia, which continued to function and feed Rome. After Emperor Diocletian locked in stability at the end of the century, his reforms reorganized Africa's administration to strengthen control. In the early 300s, Diocletian introduced the diocese as a new level of administration, grouping several provinces under a vicarius. In the Diocese of Africa, Byzacena and Tripolitania were detached from Africa Proconsularis. Mauritania was further divided from 2 to 3 provinces, with the addition of Mauritania Citifensis. But the far-off Mauritania Tingitana became part of the Diocese of Hispania, not Africa. These changes created more provincial governors over smaller units, a move aimed at more efficient governance and defence. During the 4th century, North Africa underwent a profound religious and social transformation with the spread of Christianity. Christian communities had existed since the late 2nd century, but came under persecution at different times. African saints like the Skeleton Martyrs in 180 and Perpetua and Felicitas in 203 are some famous examples. But Christian communities expanded dramatically after Emperor Constantine's legalization of the faith in 313. By the end of the 4th century, the formerly pagan province was overwhelmingly Christianized in its settled regions, with even some Berber tribal groups converting en masse. North Africa produced towering figures of the early church, like the theologian Tertullian and Saint Cyprian in 3rd century Carthage, and in the 4th century, the philosopher-bishop Augustine of Hippo. Augustine, Bishop of Hippo Regius in modern-day Algeria, became one of Latin Christianity's great doctors and a central voice against heresy. The prominence of men like Augustine, a provincial Berber by birth who mastered classical learning and Christian doctrine, exemplified a fusion of Roman intellectual culture with the new Christian faith in Africa. But the Christianization process was not without conflict. Almost as soon as the persecutions ended, Africa was struck by a major controversy, named after a bishop Donatus. During Diocletian's persecution, many clergy members weakened, handing over scriptures to the Roman authorities or partaking in pagan sacrifices. The Donatists argued that these clergymen, called traditores, had forfeited moral authority and their sacraments deemed invalid. As the new bishop of Carthage was consecrated by one deemed a traditor, a rival line was set up, first by Majorius and then Donatus. The majority Catholic Church, backed by Emperor Constantine, opposed this view, insisting the sacrament's validity did not depend on a minister's purity, a position articulated powerfully by Augustine of Hippo decades later. The dispute split the African church and society. Entire towns and regions in Numidia sided with the Donatist sect, which also drew support from rural Berbers. In some respects, the Donatist movement even took on a nationalist or anti-imperial tone. Donatists accused their Catholic rivals of being too cozy with Roman officials, while they themselves were seen as upholding a more austere, locally led faith. Violence occasionally flared, and roving bands of radical rural Donatist supporters, called circumcellions, harassed opponents, further destabilizing the countryside. Finally, in 411, after a century of schism, an imperial commission in Carthage adjudicated. The Catholic bishops were declared the rightful clergy. Donatist congregations were declared heretical and faced state suppression. The sect went underground, but persisted in Africa into the 5th century and beyond. Though the African province was rich, urbanized, and far from the barbarian invasions ravaging Europe, internal corruption provoked sporadic revolts in the 4th century. In the 360s, raids by a Berber people called the Austuriani devastated much of Tripolitania. And in the 370s, a major insurrection was led by Firmus, a Berber prince in Mauritania. He could have been as renowned as Jugurtha, but his brother Gildo supported the empire, and Firmus was defeated and committed suicide. After aiding Rome, Gildo was rewarded with the title Count of Africa, effectively becoming the imperial commander there. But in 397, sensing the Western Roman Empire's decline, Gildo himself turned traitor. He blocked the grain fleets from sailing to Italy, threatening to starve Rome. The Roman Senate declared Gildo a public enemy and dispatched an army under his own brother Mascezel, and a year later, Gildo's rebellion collapsed, just as Firmus's had, at the hands of a brother loyal to Rome. A natural disaster struck in 365 when a massive earthquake and tsunami hit the Mediterranean, devastating parts of the African coast, flooding cities and farmlands. This calamity, coupled with the general recession of the late 4th century, weakened Roman economic grip, and by around 400, independent Berber chiefdoms had reasserted control in certain mountain and desert regions. The imperial presence was mostly limited to the fertile coastal plain and major cities. Carthage remained the jewel of Africa, still a bustling capital where a cosmopolitan, increasingly Christian, Romano-African elite governed and corresponded with Rome. But an even greater upheaval was on the horizon as the Western Empire's defences crumbled elsewhere. The beginning of the end came in 429, when the Vandals, a Germanic people who had migrated through Gaul into Hispania, set their sights on the African provinces. Led by their astute King Gaiseric, around 80,000 Vandals and Alans, an Iranic nomadic people, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into Mauritania Tingitana in the spring. It's possible that the Roman governor of Africa, Count Boniface, might have initially invited the Vandals as allies in a power struggle, but it was a decision he soon regretted. Once the Vandals arrived, they moved eastward along the coast with alarming speed. The Roman defense in Africa was weak and divided. Social rifts lingered, as the Donatist controversy was still fresh, and not all segments of the population were committed to resisting the invaders. The Vandals made their way through Numidia, making alliances with some disaffected Berber tribes. Town after town either fell or opened its gates. By 430, Gaiseric's forces reached the outskirts of Hippo Regius, where St. Augustine resided. The Vandals besieged Hippo for months. Augustine, now aging, died during the siege on the 28th of August. Hippo fell shortly after. A poignant end for Christian Romano-African urban life. Within a decade of their landing, the Vandals effectively dismantled the rest of Roman power. In 435 CE, the Western Roman Empire ceded them control of coastal Numidia, and in 439, Gaiseric boldly seized Carthage, turning the great city into the capital of a new Vandal kingdom. The fall of Carthage, Rome's ancient foe and later its second city, marked an end to the Western Roman era in Africa. The Vandals, though few in number, ruled as a warrior elite over the fertile African territories, dominating the very grain supply that once sustained Rome. Roman civilization in Africa entered a steep decline after 429, from which it would never fully recover. The golden age of Roman Africa had ended, giving way to a new and uncertain future. But back in Egypt, there was a century of bishops and emperors on the Nile, as the empire continued in Byzantine Egypt.